What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from SBMTG down there on the YouTube.com, and today I've got results for one of the biggest tournaments on the Magic calendar, Pro Tour Eldritch Moon. Now, there has been, leading up to this tournament the last couple of weeks, a lot of talk, a lot of speculation, analysis, and discussion about this format as we know it so far. Bad Company looks super strong. What decks are good other than that? Is Green-Black Delirium good like at all? Is Green-White Token still even a deck? A lot of questions were answered by this tournament. And today, I'll give you the top 8, starting with first place. After the dust settled and the smoke cleared, I gotta congratulate Lucas Blohan of the Czech Republic, who came in first place today with, get this, White-Black Control. Here's the list right here. A lot of players chose to play this deck for the Pro Tour, and it represented about 5% of the field on day one, but the deck had a horrible conversion rate to day two, and a lot of White-Black Control players were sent home on day one. And as such, a lot of spectators wrote this deck off after the first day, and Blohan was actually down 2 games in the quarterfinals before going on to win 9 games in a row with the deck, and eventually securing first place. And the best part is that the finals match saw him as the definite underdog, as not only is the other deck in the finals, Temur Emerge, we'll talk about that in a second, a very bad matchup for White-Black Control, or at least it's supposed to be, but he went up against Owen Turtenwald, who is Player of the Year, a recent Hall of Fame inductee, and Lucas was still able to win 3 games in a row with this White-Black Control deck. Actually, the best part was the flavor win in this matchup. Lucas's Liliana would go up against Owen's Emrakul and emerge victorious. Puns. So anyway, it's a cool story, right? But what about the actual deck here? Well, it's not really that different from the White-Black Control that we've seen all season, except that it gets to add Liliana, who looked spectacular on camera this weekend. Like, every time she was on camera, she was taking over the whole game by herself. And we saw her ultimate in multiple games, and her ultimate just wins, it turns out. But other than that, high-value format staple game winners like Kalitas and Avacyn help you close the door after we've gained control of the board with these like 20 or so removal pieces in the deck. But it is worth noting that this is not the White-Black Angels deck that's been gaining traction over the last couple of weeks here, but instead a return to form for the deck, acting as more of an all-in control deck. And so my question really is, since world champion Seth Manfield won Grand Prix New York with White-Black Control, and White-Black Control just won the Pro Tour, can we finally consider this a real deck? Like, please? It keeps winning, like, huge events and nobody cares about it. So maybe now this deck will get the recognition that it deserves. Second place, the other deck in the finals of PT Eldritch Moon, was, I've already mentioned this, Owen Turtenwald's Temur Emerge. Check this list out right here. Really haven't seen anything like this so far this season. And I gotta say, man, Owen wanted it all. Like, Player of the Year, Hall of Famer, Pro Tour Eldritch Moon champion, like, and it all seemed to be in the cards, again, pun intended, when he sat down across from Lucas Blohan. And my favorite story, this is my favorite story of the event, actually. One more cool story time with Devin here. Turtenwald had been testing and almost locked into a different deck before this tournament, but he just kept losing to Emrakul. So since he couldn't beat him, he decided to join her, and he played an Emrakul deck of his own. Now, here's the fun part. The deck he had been testing for a couple of weeks before this tournament, White-Black Control. That's ironic and all, but we're actually here to talk about this deck, and it's a sweet one. First of all, Temur players rejoice. You are vindicated. After Temur spent like over a year as the worst clan in a standard all-about 3-color clans, it emerges, there's that pun again, today as one of the best decks in the whole event, honestly, and probably one of the best decks in the format. Just check out everything this deck does. It uses cards like Vessel of Nascency, Gather the Pack, and Grapple with the Past to find what you need and fill your graveyard. And it also, you have the chance of milling Kozilek's Return, which is very important for the deck too. But a full yard makes Emrakul, Ishkana, and Narwood Dryad all better. And it uses Elder Deep Fiend, by the way. Even though Pilgrim's Eye, of all things, is the only good main deck emerge target. It plays Kozilek's Return, there's that card again, so that when you play Emrakul or Deep Fiend, or Wretched Griff for that matter, which is randomly in the deck, you can wipe the board, and it only plays, check this out, 21 lands. Like, what? This deck is like extremely difficult, or different. It's probably difficult to play, but a very different deck. But it's pretty simple when you think about it. It really just wants to play off of the interaction between Big Eldrazi and Kozilek's return, and it devotes the early game to sort of setting up this interaction. Our mid-game and in-game is like ridiculously strong, but we're pretty naked early. This was a good metagame call though, because the format is sort of warping around Liliana and Spell Queller, and this strategy is very good against both of those cards in most games, despite today's results. So, you know, facts remain facts, and going over the top, which this deck is designed to do, appears to be very good against both Liliana and Spell Queller right now. Altogether, just a super exciting deck that not many people saw coming. People have been trying to make Blue-Red Eldrazi work because of the interaction between Deep Fiend and Kozilek's return. People knew that was going to be a thing. It's just what form is it going to take? And this definitely looks like a very, very good shell for that combo to go into. Let's start with the semifinals here, and from here on out, it's like, you know, the next two decks came in technically 4th place, and then the other 4 decks came in technically 8th place. But I'm still going to sort of rank them, depending on how I like them, basically. So I'll put Sam Pardee in 4th place right here. He ended up piloting a build of green-black Delirium into the top 8 that actually looks kind of familiar. Actually, they're not quite the same list, his and ours. Not at all. But they have the same basic idea, you know. It's basically maximize the value of Grimflayer, Liliana, and Ishkana and blow stuff off the board. That's mostly what we're trying to do. Do note, by the way, the 4 of Traverse the Ulvenwald in this deck, because perhaps surprisingly, Traverse was one of the most played cards of the weekend. It was 4 ofs in a lot of decks, and you'll see 4 ofs here in like 3 of these decks, I think it is, that I cover in this top 8. And Traverse was in nearly every list that played green, other than the Bant Company lists. And I should point out, by the way, that there is a second version of Delirium that also did very well. Both decks had very good day 1 conversion rates. A lot of people made it in day 2, is basically what conversion rate means in context here. And this version is probably the deck that will end up being more popular, just because it did better. And Grimflayer looks like a really fun card. You know, obviously I've played a lot with Grimflayer, and I've had a lot to say about how much I like the card. But there was another version of the deck at the tournament that plays just, you know, the package that we'll see a lot in this video of Grapple with the Past and Gather the Pack and Vessel of Nascency, you know, all the sort of traditional Delirium enablers. And then played like more control-y and a lot of top end and stuff. But this deck was a little bit more aggro-y and did a little bit better on the weekend as a whole. So going forward, I'm probably, you know, I'm going to call this as probably the Delirium build that we'll see most often. And it did a ton of work over the weekend and was on camera a few times. Just obviously, you know, honestly, it's arrived. Like, Delirium has arrived, and I'm really happy about that because I've wanted this mechanic to be very good since its inception, but it hasn't had the right tools. And in this top 8, we'll see, you know, Owen Turtenwald's deck wanted some Delirium. This deck is a straight-up Delirium deck. We'll see another red-green ramp deck later that emphasizes Delirium a little bit. So Delirium has a lot of play in this format in a lot of different deck types, and I'm super happy about that. But as far as just the straight-up Delirium build, this is probably the one we're going to be seeing moving forward. Next up, the other semifinal competitor was the esteemed Luis Scott Vargas. He's just everywhere. He's just continuing his run of Pro Tour top 8s. He just keeps doing that. With Bant Company, of all things. Luis does often play what is considered the best deck in the format, and Bant Company definitely was going into the tournament. And he did manage to beautifully pilot this deck. You know, he ends up losing to Turtenwald in the semis, but the first couple of games of that match are just very well played by Luis, and he's making it look really easy. That's how the announcers put it. He makes it look easy, and he really does. But that's LSV. You know, I will say the deck ended up with a weak finish overall. Not necessarily LSV. He ended up with a very strong finish, but the deck overall. This was played more than any other deck going into game 1. This was nearly 20% of the field, but that ended up being, you know, having the worst conversion rate of any deck of the tournament. A lot of Bant Company players went home on day 1. I mean, that's crazy considering that Bant Company was, as everyone keeps putting it, the boogeyman of the format going into the tournament, but it looks like it's been largely solved by all these decks that are going over the top of it. That's definitely a running theme, and we'll go into that a little bit more later too. But really, a lot of this I think had to do with Luis Scott Vargas's skill as a Magic player. He's just an incredibly good Magic player. And I will say also that he played a card that other Bant Company decks have not been playing, even though we should have already learned this lesson from SCG Open Columbus, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later too. I don't think Bant Company is just completely dead. I don't think it's out of the format. It's got 2 Pro Tour Eldritch Moon top 8 finishes, and it still has a lot of the tools that it needs to win games. But in this format, it can run into both Liliana and Emrakul, and those are both 2 cards that it has a hard time beating. Let's move into the quarterfinals here, and you can sort of look at it as these next 4 decks either all came in 5th or they all came in 8th, you know, whatever you want to say. I'll just go in sort of the order that I want to go in here, and I'll start with Reed Duke, one of my favorite Magic players. I really like Reed Duke an awful lot, and he elected to play a red-green Delirium Ramp deck. Here's the list right here. It sort of heavily resembles, at least the main idea of it, resembles the Teamer deck that was played by Owen, except it cuts blue and it doesn't lean on Kozilek's Return as much, although it is still a 3-of. The deck's top end is super scary. It's got Worldbreaker, Atarka, Emrakul, and even like Ulvenwald Hydra. Ishkana is there, as she is in many decks here. This is yet another deck, by the way, that plays Ishkana and Traverse. And notice the presence, again, of Gather the Pack, Vessel of Nascency, and Grapple with the Past. It's sort of a package that finds creatures, it fuels Delirium, and does a lot of stuff for us, and gives us some action in the early game, helps set us up. Just that package of 3 cards is very good right now. It sort of sacrifices the versatility of Turtenwald's deck. You know, Owen's deck is doing a lot of different things, and doing them well, but this deck sacrifices that versatility for a much more singular focus, which may appeal to you, depending on your playstyle. I mean, it's definitely a very different ramp deck than we're used to seeing in this format. It cuts Goggles completely and all of the Goggles tricks in favor of just adding a bunch of bomby creatures, and most importantly here, card advantage. You know, we're not seeing the Magmatic Insight and Tormenting Voice tricks or anything, but we are just seeing, again, the package of Grapple and Gather the Pack and Vessel of Nascency doing a lot for us in the early game, and helping secure the cards that we need to eventually win. Speaking of red-green ramp, Ken Yukihiro also played a red-green ramp deck, 2 red-green ramp decks in the finals of PT Eldritch Moon. Here it is right here. And it's a little bit different from Duke's deck. This one runs Hangerback Walker. It's got Tormenting Voice and Collective Defiance. I like that a 4-of CD showed up in this deck. And it doesn't play the package I was just talking about, Grapple, Gather, Vessel. It is nice to see how many versions of this green-red ramp deck are available right now, and ramp will probably remain a somewhat viable strategy, even after rotation, I'm calling, because it does lose like Nissa's Pilgrimage, Explosive Vegetation, but it will still have a bunch of creatures, and it will still have ways of ramping very easily. And the reason I say that it will probably remain relevant is because going bigger than, I'll say these 2 cards again, Liliana and Spellqueller, seems to be a winning strategy. We see that a lot in this top 8 here, you know. And Ishkana is a card that comes up an awful lot. That's because she beats Spellqueller. She's very good against Liliana. Just creates a ton of value, you know. Just anything that's like 5 mana beats Spellqueller, and anything that's reasonably big is going to beat Liliana to death too. So just going very high up on the curve and going over the top seems to be very good right now in this meta, and maybe we'll see a resurgence of ramp. The last 2 decks I'll talk about are decks that we've seen other versions of already in the top 8, so I won't spend too much time on them, but I will note how different they are from the other decks we've already seen. First of all, Yuta Takahashi, one of the best Magic players in the entire world. He also played Bant Company today. Here's his list. It is very subtly different from LSV's list, but it's got a couple of key differences. Mostly that it doesn't play Avacyn. I feel like that was not a great decision, but I can't really question Yuta. Yuta is amazing. So there's that. But not playing Avacyn, I think, made a huge difference. And there is another thing that he elected not to play, and LSV did play. And it eerily repeats something we saw at SCG Open Columbus. I alluded to this earlier. One thing that separated it and ended up winning it the entire tournament was the inclusion of Selfless Spirit, where a lot of decks didn't do that. LSV plays Selfless Spirit, and he makes it to the semifinals. Yuta plays Jace instead and gets blown out in the quarters. Going forward, I am really hoping that these decks take Selfless Spirit very seriously. It's got amazing synergy with Avacyn, which these decks really ought to play, you would imagine. It's got really good synergy with Avacyn, and it's just really good in a lot of situations just on its own. You know, combat situations that are weird, or spot removal. You know, Selfless Spirit is very good for a lot of reasons. Another thing I noticed, and I'm not quite sure if this is 100% or if I'm just a thing that I think I'm seeing, but I've noticed watching LSV that playing fast seems to benefit Coco. So these builds that play Jace and Ojutai's command just don't feel as good right now. They're more mid-rangey, whereas something that plays all these smaller creatures and just gets on the board very quickly and starts dealing flying damage looks fantastic right now in this meta. So, you know, there are still 2 Bant Company decks in the top 8 though, and Utah's one of the best in the world at this game. So we haven't heard the last from this deck. We've got 2.5 weeks of testing left until World Championships, the biggest tournament of the entire year. So Bant Company has time to bounce back. It all just depends on what form the deck ultimately ends up taking. So I'm really interested to see where it goes for its last, you know, big hurrah at the World Championships, because after then, well, really after September 30th, we won't be able to play Collected Company anymore, but World Championships are sort of the last big tournament where we can play Company. So we'll have to see how this deck does in that tournament, and I'm thinking that it'll probably drop off the map a little bit. It'll still be a Tier 1 standard deck, but after its performance at this tournament, especially against a couple of key decks, I definitely think that its use will drop off considerably. And finally, as far as decks we'll cover in the top 8 here, I got a couple other decks I want to talk about at the very end of the video here. But coming in, I guess, 5th or 8th, is Andrew Brown with Teamer Emerge. Another Teamer Emerge deck, but this one very, very different from Turtenwald's, although again, sort of has the same focus. Again, the basic idea, still the same. You use Grapple, Gather the Pack, and Vessel, and they're here again doing what they do. And the Deep Fiend Kozilek's Return combo is still here too. But Andrew's angling really hard towards Emerge here. He's playing full play sets of Primal Druid and Matter Reshaper for the value off of Emerge, and he's leaning really heavily on Wretched Griff. He's playing a full 4 of Wretched Griff, and he's even playing a 1 of Lashweed Lurker, which has been, that seems like a very good card to play 1 of, by the way. And he's sneaking in a couple of cards here. He's sneaking in Shaman of Forgotten Ways, of all things. It's crazy. And he's completely cutting Emrakul. I think it's got like 1 of in the sideboard. But from the main deck, he's completely cut it, and that may have been a mistake, seeing how well Emrakul performed over the weekend. But overall, this deck looks really exciting and maybe less spiky than the Owen Turtenwald version of the deck, but just as viable and possibly more fun, which is important. Time will tell, sort of as this deck takes shape, but we'll see if the 2 builds combine. You know, perhaps Owen's build cuts Nissa's Pilgrimage and adds Primal Druid. You know, that's entirely possible, but either way, the deck obviously has plenty of flexibility. That's important to note, and a lot of room to improve, and it's really unique. So we'll see how it evolves over the next couple of weeks here until the Worlds, because I think that this deck probably will show up in some form or another at Worlds, but I'm really thinking that they'll probably combine in some way or another. But this is just a completely different build that's doing a lot of the same things, which is weird, but that's what's going on here. And the other thing I want to talk about before I finish out here is what we're doing next, and it actually coincides here with PT Eldritch Moon. A deck that was very, very good on day 1, but didn't have a very good conversion rate into the last day of the tournament. You know, it didn't show up in the top 8 at all, which really depressed a lot of people because it was so strong the first couple of days of the tournament. I'm talking here, babbling, about Blue-Black Zombies, of all things, a deck that people really have wanted to see on the channel a lot lately. I don't blame you. It turns out the deck is actually extremely strong and is known as the Bant Killer. You know, Bant Company, again, one of the strongest decks in this format, and a big reason that Bant Company had a bad day 1 conversion rate into day 2 was because Blue-Black Zombies existed. All the writings that I've seen, a lot of people are saying that Blue-Black Zombies has something like a 75% favorable matchup against Bant Company. So that's crazy, you know, like, it's just, a lot of people hate Bant Company, and it's a scourge of a lot of FNMs, not to mention the higher level events. So something like Blue-Black Zombies seems really, really appealing, not to mention the fact that just zombies are fun and people like them. So I really, really, really want to cover this deck next time. So stay tuned for that, because it's got a lot of cool tricks and turns and stuff in it, and some cards I would have never thought it would play, but it totally does. So stay tuned for that. I'll be covering that very soon in the next few days. Just want to get a bunch of games in with it and see what's up, because I already know how the deck's supposed to function. I just want to see it for myself. So give me a couple days and I'll have that out for you, plus secret video super soon. So stay tuned for all that. And if you enjoyed this coverage of Pro Tour Eldritch Moon, just give me a like. Hit the thumbs up button. It takes 2 seconds and it's the best thing you can do for my channel. So please do that. And sub if you're new so you can get all the crazy content coming up. I'm Dev from SBMTG. As always, thanks for watching, my wizards.